We're going to get started while James changes the microphone out by reading you an article I read last night, posted by one of our former parishioners. It's from a website called Bustle. It's called "Raising Children Without Religion May Be a Better Alternative, Suggests New Research." Gone are the days of the unyielding, God-fearing mother as the archetype of good parenting, suggests a recent article from the Los Angeles Times. According to multiple reports, research has shown that secular upbringings may be healthier for children who, according to a 2010 Duke University study, display less susceptibility to racism and peer pressure and are less vengeful, less nationalistic, less militaristic, less authoritarian, and more tolerant on average than religious adults. But the list of benefits don't stop there, says the Times. Citing Pew Research, the Times' Phil Zuckerman notes that there's been a recent spike in American households who categorize themselves as nuns for their religious affiliation to nothing in particular. According to Zuckerman, modern non-religious adults account for 23% of Americans, while as early as the 50s, that figure was only 4%. And with godlessness on the rise, researchers have begun analyzing the benefits of non-religious child rearing more closely. Far from being dysfunctional, nihilistic, and rudderless without the security and rectitude of religion, writes Zuckerman, secular households provide a sound and solid foundation for children, according to Vern Bankston, a USC professor of gerontology and sociology. Bankston oversees an ongoing study called the Longitudinal Study of Generations, the largest study of families and their religious affiliations in America. After noticing an uptick in non-religious households, Bankston added secularism to his study in 2013. Many non-religious parents were more coherent and passionate about their ethical principles than some of the religious parents in our study, said Bankston in an interview with Zuckerman. The vast majority appeared to live goal-filled lives characterized by moral directions and sense of life having a purpose. For secular people, morality is predicated on one simple principle: empathic reciprocity, widely known as the Golden Rule, treating other people as you would like to be treated. It is an ancient, universal ethical imperative, and it requires no supernatural beliefs. And check this out. According to Zuckerman, atheists were almost absent from our prison population as of the late 1990s, accounting for less than half of 1% of inmates, according to reports by the Federal Bureau of Prisons. This echoes what the criminology field has documented for more than a century, he writes. The unaffiliated and the non-religious engage in far fewer crimes. Additionally, a troublesome report from BBC last year found that religious children were less likely than their non-religious peers to distinguish fantasy from reality, based on a study conducted by Boston University. Presented with realistic, religious, and fantastical stories, children were then asked whether they thought the story was real or fictional. Researchers found that children with a religious upbringing tended to view the protagonists in religious stories as real, whereas children from non-religious households saw them as fictional. And why is this problematic? Because it muddles the waters of a child's differentiation between reality and fiction, says the study, and even the spiritual from the fantastical. For secular people, morality is predicated, here's that statement again, on one simple principle: empathic reciprocity, widely known as the Golden Rule, treating other people as you would like to be treated. You can read more of this at the LA Times. With all of this in mind, go forth and rear your godless hellfire demon children, y'all. That's how it ends. Is my microphone back? No? Okay. Now, just to be rebellious, let's read from the scripture. James chapter 2. My dear brothers and sisters, how can you claim to have faith in our glorious Lord Jesus Christ if you favor some people over others? For example, suppose that someone comes into your meeting dressed in fancy clothes and expensive jewelry, and another comes in who is poor and dressed in dirty clothes. If you give special attention and a good seat to the rich person, but you say to the poor one, you can stand over there, or else you could also maybe sit on the floor. Well, doesn't this discrimination show that your judgments are guided by evil motives? Listen to me, dear brothers and sisters. Hasn't God chosen the poor in this world to be rich in faith? Aren't they the ones who will inherit the kingdom he promised to those who love him? But you dishonor the poor. Isn't it the rich who oppress you and drag you into court? Aren't they the ones who slander Jesus Christ, whose noble name you bear? Yes, indeed, it is good when you obey the royal law as found in the scriptures that say, love your neighbor as yourself. But if you favor some people over others, you are committing a sin. You are guilty of breaking the law. For the person who keeps all of the laws except one is as guilty as a person who has broken all of God's laws. For the same God who said, you must not commit adultery, also said, you must not murder. So if you murder someone but do not commit adultery, you have still broken the law. So whatever you say or whatever you do, remember that you will be judged by the law that sets you free. There will be no mercy for those who have not shown mercy to others. But if you have been merciful, God will be merciful when he judges you. Okay. What is this passage about? It is not about raising your children without religion, but there is a tie in there, which is why I chose to highlight it. Also because I needed time for James to change the microphone. What is this passage about, and how does it relate to last week's passage? Remember that these books were not written as books, they were written as what? Letters. So there should be some sort of flow to them, right? So what's the connection between the two passages? And what were we talking about last week? We were talking about anger. What else? We're supposed to take care of other people. We're talking about self-control. We're talking about this year. What are we talking about? We are, yes, I was just looking at the hyperlink, or the link that was set up there to view the article. We are talking about wisdom and maturity this year. Last year, we're talking about what? Tell me you haven't forgotten. Faith. We're talking about real faith, blind faith versus real faith, right? So, is there a hope for me over here, or no? Something wrong with the microphone? Interesting. All right. Can you bring me this mic? I need to move. It helps my process. So James chapter 1 says that faith, it concludes with the concept that true faith is doing what? Doing what? No. No guesses, people. James chapter 1 concludes with the concept that true faith is doing what? Yes, taking care of the widows and orphans. Then he goes on to say in chapter 2 that we are not supposed to do what? Show favoritism, right? Do you see that there may be a connection here? There is a direct line of thought involved. See, the people that were widows and orphans, as I explained last week, are people who couldn't take care of themselves in that culture. Now, the people who you might say that come into the church gathering, you should go stand over there, or you maybe should sit on the floor, they might be people who appear to not be able to do what? Take care of themselves. So there is a direct connection between the thought process in James chapter 1 and James chapter 2. This is a different mic. I don't know this mic.
Thinking outside the box.
Does that work? Yeah? Yeah? Okay, it works. I'm turning this mic off. Okay. There we go. Now the question that I have for you is, how does that relate to favoritism? Well, how does true faith as being what you should do relate to favoritism being what you should not do? What is not true faith? Well, I'll tell you what true faith is not. It's not dotting your I's. It's not crossing your T's. It's not being theological. It's not being overly zealous. I mean, you can be theological and have true faith. You can dot your I's and cross your T's. Certainly Jesus did, right? But that is not what true faith is. That is a semblance of faith. It's a dressing of true faith. But if you have those things, that doesn't make you have true faith. We know that in the most stark example, because who were the people that killed Christ? Those people who were theological, who were zealous, and were followers of the law. Okay? So just because you have those three things does not make you have true faith. In the same vein, what it does lead you to is a disparity in how you treat people. So we see that the disparity in how you treat people is connected then to your true faith. In other words, how you treat people determines whether your faith is trued. When I say trued, I mean in the sense of a bike tire. You guys know what truing a tire is? So, a tire needs to be perfect in its shape, right? Because if the tire is a little bit wobbly, then the tire will go in different directions, okay? That's called truing, keeping a tire true. So, in the same vein, your faith will not be true in the sense that it won't go the right direction unless you keep it a certain way. In other words, showing favoritism doesn't help you to have true faith. Now, I'll be honest, on the surface, it sounds like a really dumb passage. Like favoritism, faith, how do those really connect to each other? But it's not. What it is an issue of maturity. How is it an issue of maturity? Are we not allowed to be in groups where we say, I like this person more than the other person? Am I not allowed to show favorites to Michaela because she's my favorite person in the world? Am I not allowed to do that? According to this, am I immature in my faith if I do that? How do we reconcile those two? Well, that is the question for today. So, part of it has to do with understanding the Greek. I've heard it said that the Greek doesn't matter. I'm here to tell you that it does matter. It is the original language. It was given to us in that language for a reason because it is specific. So part of that is understanding the Greek and what the word favoritism means in the Greek. Because in English, it sort of translates to something childish. But in Greek, it is not something childish. Let me tell you a little bit about James. There are two Jameses that were around Jesus. Did you guys know that? So, the James that is here is which James? Is he the brother of Jesus or not the brother of Jesus? He is the brother of Jesus. James is the half-brother of Jesus, born of Joseph and of Mary. He is the younger half-brother of Jesus. James was nowhere to necessarily be found during the crucifixion scene. He wasn't necessarily the greatest of guys or whatever. He wasn't the worst of guys, but he was one of Jesus' disciples. Now, who did James end up becoming? According to history, who did James end up becoming in church history? Anyone know? So you have this guy, he's the younger brother of Jesus, our Lord. And he's kind of, low grade on the totem pole. And then true to form of God and his sense of inverted apologetics, what happens? The younger ends up becoming the head of the movement. James is, at the time of writing this, the head of Christianity, essentially. Now, one could argue that Paul is the head of Christianity, but that's not really true. Paul is the head of theology in Christianity, if you guys understand what I mean by that. Paul is the most skilled, scholarly person that's out there. He's very well respected. But when Paul wanted to come and serve God, what did he do? He went to the leadership, and that leadership was headed by who? James. Now you think that it would be Peter, because the Roman Catholic Church wants us to think it's Peter, but it's not actually Peter. The church in Jerusalem, which was the center of Christianity, was headed by James. Not James the son of Zebedee, but James the Just. When you look at history, James is known as James the Just. Now, why do I tell you that James is known as James the Just? There's an interesting story that tradition holds about James. It's really one of the most epic stories. Tradition tells us that Peter was crucified upside down. Okay? You guys know about that? Tradition tells us that John was beheaded, or that John was not beheaded, sorry. That John wasn't beheaded, that he died, I was thinking of John the Baptist, that he died of old age. What does tradition tell us about James? That's what I thought. Here's what tradition tells us about James, the younger brother of Jesus, head of the church of Jerusalem, the Just. That James was standing in a crowd of people with Pharisees, and people were coming to Christ based upon what was being preached. The Pharisees didn't like it, and so they said to James, James, you're the leader of these people. Do something about this. We're telling you to do something about this. These people listen to you, James. So James said, okay, I will do something about this. Clearly people are getting riled up, they're getting excited in their newfound faith. I'm going to do something about this. So James goes up to the very top of the synagogue, of the temple, and he stands above the crowd. And then what does he do? He preaches the craziest sermon ever, and even more people come to Christ, which makes the Pharisees so mad and the Jewish leaders so mad that they race up to the roof and throw him off. That is James the Just. So I want you to understand who we're talking about when we're talking about this. Why am I bringing that up? Because the word in Greek is not favoritism. The word in Greek is prosopolemsia. Prosopolemsia. What it means is respecter of men. That's weird, right? We translate that into favoritism because it's sloppy. But what the word prosopolemsia means is respecter of men. James says that we are not to be respecters of men. So what does it mean to be a respecter of men? This is what it means. The fault of one who, when called on to requite or to give judgment, has respect as to the outward circumstance of a man, and not to their intrinsic merits, and so prefers, as the more worthy of the two, one who is rich, high-born, or powerful to another who is destitute of such gifts. So we've termed it in our sloppy English language as favoritism, but that's not really true. What we're talking about here is a person who looks at the glimmer of things. Remember that? We talked about that in the first sermon of the year, about the glimmer of things, about being entranced by things. James says that we are not to show favoritism. We are not to look only at the surface level of what is before us, to be a respecter of men. We are instead to look beyond the surface and be a respecter of God. Specifically what? The image of God within a person. We respect people who come through our doors not because of what they wear, not because of how good they look, of how pretty or attractive they are, or what nice fragrances they have, or how much money they have. We are supposed to respect them because of the image of God within them. We, in fact, are not respecting each other. We are respecting God. And in respecting God, we are respecting each other. How does that rub you? I am not called to respect you. I'm called to respect God. Does that rub you the wrong way? Well, it does society. How often are we told in society that, I was watching Biggest Loser last night. I found all of these things. I found all of these things about myself because I lost 500, okay, that's not right. I lost 330 pounds. But you know what I found most of all? I found that I respected myself. I remember in the 80s, I do remember this, in the 80s being taught about self-esteem in school. That was a big push. Self-esteem, how we feel as individuals. It's important that we feel good about ourselves. And it's important that we respect each person's individuality, that we are tolerant of each other. We're to be respecters of men. When we translate that down to the English, they're telling us to show favoritism. We are to show favoritism. Now, not favoritism to a specific type of dressing or talking or or amount of money or social class, but favoritism between what two things or people? This is the choice that it boils down to. Favoritism between man or favoritism between God. We are called by society to respect men. We are called by God to respect God. And in God we find the value of men. So this article, it says, for secular people, morality is predicated on one simple principle: empathic reciprocity. You know what I call that? Social contract theory. Oh, they're so new with their new terms. These aren't new. It's not new terms. It's not new thought process. It's old thought process masquerading in psychological terminology. Empathic reciprocity. It's social contract theory. I'm not impressed by it. This is supposedly widely known as the Golden Rule. Oh, now we're masquerading as theology. Treating other people as you would like to be treated. It's an ancient, universal, ethical imperative, and it requires no supernatural beliefs. I'm sorry, but are you always in a good mood, and do you always think of other people? How would you like to be treated? Would you like to be treated like a god? Would you like to be given every single thing that you want to be given when you want it, because you want it? Because if everybody was being true to themselves, then that's exactly what they would treat themselves like. That is how we treat ourselves when we are alone. Is it not?
Or is it at least not the struggle that we have? It's not big enough. That is why when we try to apply these things like social contract theory or empathic reciprocity, even with the best intentions, it boils down. Because man destroys himself. Because when men respect men, they build Babel. They're capable of doing anything. And in being capable of doing anything, they forget that God is God and they are merely men. So, are we called to be respectable as Christians? Are we? No. We're not. We are not called to be respectable. We are called to be holy. We are not called to be respectable. We are called to be holy, because the respectability of men says that if I am taking care of my family, I am working a 9-to-5 job, I am working toward owning a house, having the right car, putting food on the plate, and that's what being respectable is. That is not the reality of God. It might be a reality that God gives or blesses one of us with, but it is not the base level reality. And sometimes respectability before God means making sacrifices that men would not sacrifice. Because the respectability of men says, kill the Messiah. The respectability of men says, Jesus didn't come in the package that we wanted him to. So we're going to murder him, so that we can keep things in our nice, neat little package. But the holiness of God doesn't care about those things. The holiness of God can come in the form of a scholar such as Paul, or it can come in the form of a vagabond such as John the Baptist. It doesn't matter. We are not to be respecters of men. We are not to care about self-esteem. We are not to uplift the spirit of men. We are to uplift the spirit of God. The gift of exhortation does what? Does it lift the individual, or does it lift up God? Everyone here knows that when the Spirit moves, what does it move? It moves in such a way that it never glorifies itself, never glorifies its gifts, never glorifies the individual. So it's not about ourselves, and guess what? It's really not about each other. It's not about being respecters of men, it's about being respecters of God. I love you because God made you who you are. And in you, I can see God's distinct handiwork. You are a distinct creation of God, and I love you because of it. You didn't make yourself into that. When we show favoritism, that's what we're doing. So how does that apply to being faithful? Well, there's a very clear line that's being drawn, isn't there? Favoritism is not faithful. That is the treatise. Being a respecter of men is not being faithful. He says very clearly at the end of chapter 1 that we are supposed to do good works, specifically that we are supposed to help those who are helpless. Who is God? In the context of what we're talking about, who is God? God is the one who helps those who are helpless. He is the one who listens to the cries of the people who are dejected. He's the one who is our Savior, our banner, our hope, our rock. How can we call ourselves faithful if we are not that? If instead of being faithful to the holiness of who God is, we are respecters of men. I tell you about James the Just, and I ask you how it relates to this. What did James do? He was told to be a respecter of men. And what did he do? He respected God. And in respecting God, it got him killed. And that is the display of faithfulness that we are talking about. It comes down to the lowest form, at least in James's mind it did. It comes down to the lowest form of whether you treat a person correctly when they walk into that building. Whether you view it as Christ entering, as the image of God walking in a human body into that building, it is no different to James than standing before the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the rich people that wanted him to stop and going the other direction and saying, I will not stop. And he was willing to die for it. Clearly, we are not talking about favoritism the way that we have come to understand it. And clearly that level of choosing to favorite the position of man versus to favorite the position of God. Clearly that understanding that this may not be respectable, but I am not called to be respectable. I am called to be holy. Clearly that is a question of the maturity of your faith. So, as we go to discuss, I want you to ask yourself, where in your faith are you fighting this issue? Where in your faith are you struggling with the difference between being respectable versus being holy? It can be as small as a person entering the sanctuary. It can be as large as standing up to, a crowd of people telling you that you need to preach something this way. Where do you see the difference between the two? Where do you think the difference lies? And how is that playing out? And do you see it, and are you beginning to see it as an issue of maturity versus an issue of, as a non-issue? Okay, go discuss.